The end of another season. Season 5. There's a mailbag still to go. And in this mailbag, we have DM questions, player questions, and podcasting questions. But let's get started with Shorel. Shorel asks, how do you handle giving RP spotlight opportunities to players who are struggling to find their character's voice? And of course, RP here being roleplay. It's going to be trial and error. The barriers we put up emotionally are extremely complex as humans. And this could all stem from some isolated incident when they were 5 years old when they were told they were bad at acting. And that built into these massive walls they have around performance. And this is really common for kids who grew up in the 90s. There was a thought philosophy: you should pursue your dreams, but you should also be naturally good at whatever you pursue. So if you weren't naturally good at something, you should avoid it. Kind of ignores the whole purpose of practice, where you're bad at something until you become sort of good at it. But every generation has had its oddities. Now, the best thing you can do is a solo or very small group adventure to encourage that player to have more spotlight. And the spotlight isn't dramatically turning on them in front of everybody else there. That small adventure can give them a chance to practice their character before they show it off to the rest of the group. But one of the main defensive measures I see in players who are nervous about acting is they talk in third person. They want a description to stand in place for the interaction they should be having. Now, of course, there's nothing wrong with saying, I tell the group what I know after they just sat and listened to the player getting that information by themselves, and then the player returns to the group and says, I share what I now know. You're saving time. But if you go into a shop and you say, I tell the shopkeep about how I want to buy some swords, that's an opportunity for you, the DM, to pounce on. And you need to represent your desire for this game to be role-played. So instead of, maybe you were planning a shy shopkeeper or someone very robotic, but our new player is interacting here, so go big. Ah, traveler, what sort of swords are you looking for today? And if they try to continue that third person, encourage them further to break that into their character. This is all the easier in person, where you can use your body language, lean into them, engage them directly, look in their eyeballs, and let you know that this character, this swordsmith, is there for them to use. It's there for them to interact with in a first-person setting. But we're avoiding a direct call-out here. The shopkeep is fine because that player walked into the shop to purchase swords. They have to engage in this roleplay in order to progress in the shop. What we wouldn't want to do to encourage roleplay is call them out, put them on the spot in a situation that doesn't really call for it. And this is basic party etiquette. You don't call out people because they're quiet. You invite them to the conversation because you're interested in what they have to say. A random town guard, when interviewing the party, would not say, and you've been awfully quiet. What's your story? That's just, that's weird in the party, that's weird in the game. But there's nothing wrong with them giving counsel to a king, and the king saying, what's your input on this, wizard? And do note that the swordsmith, the town guard, and the king all had the same voice because it doesn't matter. Because we're encouraging people to roleplay. Your mannerisms may change. The voice might change. That can help you get into character. But it's just about feeling free, having fun with it, and showing the player how much fun it can be to roleplay to inhabit that player. You can also check out episode 2 of season 1, Problem Players, where I talk about seating charts. You might want to put this blossoming role player across from other actor types so they can feel that energy, see what it's like to roleplay. Or it might be better to put that player next to that actor, so they don't have to look directly in their eyes while they're doing these awkward pretendings. While they break out of their shell, they can still feel that energy being in the presence of the actors. They just don't have to have it blasted in their face. And some actors can be a lot of energy. Now, when it comes to online, those physicalities, that eye contact, gets lost very easily. So you want to repeat the character's name to make sure that they know they're being engaged directly. Folks also have additional nerves about being on camera, being in front of a microphone, and all those need to be broken down. I would suggest breaking those down in a different game. Play whatever video game you enjoy, just get that person talking into a mic until they're comfortable, and then we can bridge that subject of role-playing live on a microphone. You can also be generous with inspiration. Giving out inspiration is a great way to encourage players to do certain things, and it can be different for every single player. You could even give inspiration to a problem player for being quiet, because they did a really good job helping us get through that meeting with the king. And make sure you're embracing their goals. Make it easy for them to roleplay the character that they created. If they made a Arctic Ranger, but you want to run a forest campaign, time to make it a little Arctic, maybe an Arctic forest. Embrace that. Don't expect that player to catch up to you. They're still new at this. You can always just do forests later, once they've discovered that voice. And embrace side quests they may have. Let that player be a star of those smaller adventures you run on the side. Most of these situations can be worked out in-game with these sort of tools. If the player that you're trying to get to roleplay lacks goals, lacks a story, or is having a hard time finding a connection for their character in your story, that's when you need to have a sit-down talk. That's when you need to figure out what makes their character tick and what would get them interested in this campaign. Because a character without goals, that's going to be tough. There's going to be a lot of loose ends and a lot of wasted gameplay time as you shotgun all these different ideas to make them care. John asks a question in a similar vein. I'm a veteran player in a group with 2 new players to the game. Advice for leading roleplay or tactics without being overbearing. Sitting back silently doesn't work well. And I also don't want a bold barbarian to always ask, "What do you think, Jimbo and Dimly?" As someone who plays a barbarian with newer players, and that's a little unfair to say, the game's been going for almost 3 years now, I certainly understand the desire to increase the tactics of the group. A barbarian's strategy impact to a battle can feel relatively low. And in the early game, in the early onset of the campaign, you just let them make mistakes. You just stay quiet. And you just sort of sit back and enjoy it. You're a veteran player, you've been through this before, and you know they have certain spells that could be helpful, but it's their mistakes to make. So it's really not that different from DMing. You're waiting to pounce on an opportunity to reward the players. When they stumble through a good use of a spell or a good tactic, remember that, because your character can now bring that up. Remember that time we used the sleep spell to do X? We can do that again in this situation. Or you could call it the Great Sleepening of Trashburg, whatever you wanted to call it. And as you get into that mid-campaign, when you're around level 5, I think there's nothing wrong with saying, what's our inventory? A little bit of table talk, seeing what spells we have available, what slots are still available, helping those players remember they have certain special abilities they may have used in the past, how they could transform spells into other spells, particularly if it's going to be an important battle that we'd all like to get through alive. But absorb this issue at your table as a puzzle to be solved, and one you can help work through. Your character, and in this case a barbarian, probably doesn't have good book smarts, doesn't understand how spells work or what they do. But they might have good wisdom. They might understand focus fire. How can you communicate to those players the phrase, focus fire, or I'm going to tank the monster while you guys deal with the minions? How can you put that into a roleplay setting? I've got the big one, but we'll be overwhelmed if the goblins surround me. Okay, that's a tactic that player can now use. We're prompting them to think about AoE damaging the goblins so you can grapple CC, crowd control, the bugbear. It's a bit of a Antonio Banderas interview with a vampire situation. You've been through this all before, so sit back and enjoy their mistakes. Revel and bask in their inexperience that makes D&D so interesting and fluid, and do what you can to have an impact on it, while maintaining character. Our next question is from Zach. Do you have any advice on running a group where there are 4 players sitting at a table and one who is there virtually? How do you take care of that player? What's the best way to keep them included? I have to run with the assumption that this is a temporary solution, because for the most part, it's kind of a bad situation. If you have a really good area mic, that can help out. If the player who is joining virtually has monitor headphones, that can be a huge boost to their understanding of what's happening at the table. Those are basically non-consumer products. You would buy them from a music store, not Best Buy, that allow for multi-channel sound to be divided up, so they can know who's talking at the table when multiple voices are going at the same time. But if it's just a temporary solution, then we can stumble through this. Back in the days of 2003, we would just leave a phone off the hook, sitting on the table. The players really had no idea what was going on until they were directly addressed by the DM. We would get their participation, their turn, and then they'd go back to being lost, basically. What you need to do is encourage silence during that player's turn. Make sure everybody is aware it is their turn and it's time to shut up. And then we can go back to the rambunctious table atmosphere. And in this temporary setting, you can keep their executions more simple. Let them succeed more often. Let's say everyone is making stealth checks. Your player calling in can take 10 on that. Or every time you want to refresh those stealth checks, you just keep using the same roll for the player on the phone. It's not about excluding them. It's just about the difficulty of breaking down the table atmosphere for silence to include that player. If they want to run, jump, and do an aerial attack, get straight to the attack. Don't make them do the athletics movement check for the jump. Just keep things simple. Now, you've also got the benefit over my 2003 atmosphere, that you have a visual, that they will be on camera. If you're at the head of the table, they're at the other side of the table, facing you, and set up a system where they can raise their hand or make some sort of gesture that would let you know they want to participate and they need to call for that silence. If this is a more permanent or long-term solution, that's where the fun of it really matters. Do you enjoy conducting that atmosphere? And for me, that's a no. I would rather we play one digital game, everybody just stay home, everybody's digital, and maybe I play a second game with the people who can come over to my house. You're not running a business. Make sure you're having fun too. Hurricane asks, what are your top pieces of advice for a new D&D podcast in terms of production or gaining an audience? For insight, we are a group across several states that plays online with fantasy grounds and minis in a hand-created environment. So let's just stick to podcasting for now. You want to record your gameplay and put it up. So you need to be regular. It's going to come out once a week. The audience will expect it. They download it the same day, and they start to use it for that particular commute or drive or data entry or whatever have you. Podcast audiences are very accustomed to a certain production level. Very little background noise and consistent audio levels. So one of the first things I suggest you do is get a program called Levelator. It lets you take a wave audio file and make all the highs a certain height and all the lows a certain low, so every player comes through at the same volume. This can get tricky if you're adding music or sound effects, because now the music might be boosted up to a level that you don't want it to be during a moment of silence. In order to get that wave format file, I use Audacity, which is a free sound program. I used to use GarageBand on my Mac. Now that I'm on Windows, I just use Audacity because it's simple. I don't need more than that. After Levelator normalizes the track and gets rid of any background noises with a gate, I add it back into Audacity, and then we can output it as an MP3. That's all pretty simple stuff that you can go through relatively quickly. There are some decisions the group is going to have to make. For you, you need to decide how much editing you can handle. Do you want to slap some music at the front, some music at the end, and call it done? That's awesome. Because doing this every single week with a massive, however many hour file of actual gameplay is going to be really rough. It's going to be time consuming. And you might have passion for D&D, playing D&D and making the podcast, but you might not be passionate about the editing part. And this is where you start thinking about live to hard drive. This is why a lot of podcasts stream. When you're streaming, everything is already live. So if you want to play some sound effects for those swords that clashed, for a spell that was cast, you do it now or not at all. That particular speech where you messed up the words or mispronounced something, the live stream already saw that, so that's what the podcast is getting. Live streaming can help you gain an audience as well, but it's just a great tool to make sure that the game is being played efficiently and to cut down on editing. Live streams are also a very different beast. People expect more regularity from a live stream. There's also a popularity contest in a sense that's going on because of the viewership number, the interaction in the chat. Podcasts can be shot out into the world, and regardless of its audience size, it's still the same product for everyone. Now, on the player side of things, a podcast is going to change the way you play the game. You have to give everyone a chance to shine. And that is the DM's job, to make sure you're varying your character stories and letting them have their own episodes of sorts. But that also means that when you would maybe excuse yourself from a room to go talk to one player, the other players aren't hanging out. They're sitting quietly. In our own show, There Will Be Dungeons, there's been entire games where I've just sat there. Because I know the show is better without my character's inclusion in this moment. As for gaining an audience, I feel I have to say things that are just stereotypical. Consistency, good audio levels, good production. All those things really matter. But a great piece of advice I got long ago was don't focus on the things you like about other shows. Don't try to be those shows. Instead, avoid being the things you don't like. Try to improve on those shows. You can never be the other podcasts, but you can avoid the things you don't like about them. And in that way, you create your own unique product. And maybe there's some market research you could do, and there might be less Eberron campaigns or Forgotten Realm campaigns. You could give it a unique setting that helps onboard people to listening to the project. There's lots of other avenues we could talk about, like developing a thicker skin for audience interaction, or where to advertise your show, how to pay for advertisements on other podcasts so people learn about the show. But right now, it's really about getting started, consistency, and having that audio quality that podcast listeners have become accustomed to over the last 10 years. And that might mean, in order to invest in this project, every single player needs to get themselves a decent microphone. There could be a big barrier to entry there. Which leads me back to start having fun and see where it goes. But you do have a certain special little marketability moment here, because you have hand-created environments. Would you be willing to give those away? Sharing out assets could be a great way for your show to build a name. They might see a watermark on the corner of your asset, and they Google that, they find the show, they get to see an example of that asset in use. That's a great way to advertise your show, and build a name for yourself in the D&D community. These were big questions today, so we didn't zoom through a lot of them. There are a lot of questions I will save for future mailbags. Thank you to everybody who wrote in, because there is going to be a Season 6, and it'll start late next month, late August 2020. And there's still so much to talk about. Most dangerous monsters, making better maps for cities, conducting war, fade to black, and of course your questions in future mailbags. I want to thank you all for joining me for Season 5. You can check out the show over at kylefergusson.com, 2 S's in Fergusson. You can support the show at patreon.com/kylefergusson. Big thanks to Brian Griffith for the show's music. Another shout out to Kristen Ashton for doing the research for this season's history episode. And I will see you all with episode 1 of Season 6 in a few short weeks.